Edgar Cayce's prophecy for Donald Trump in 2026 will blow your mind. What if I told you that a man who died 80 years ago might have already seen what's coming for Donald Trump and for all of us in 2026? It sounds unbelievable, doesn't it? This story is about Edgar Cayce, a quiet, soft-spoken man from Kentucky who became known around the world as the Sleeping Prophet. Between 1901 and 1944, Cayce gave more than 14,000 readings while in a trance-like sleep state. He spoke of world wars long before they happened, of financial collapses that matched reality to the year, of rising seas, shifting weather, and global transformation. And hidden among those thousands of readings is something that seems to point directly to the time we're living in now, and to one man at the center of it all, Donald Trump. He didn't claim to be a god, a seer, or a political prophet, yet somehow, his words appear to describe the exact kind of crisis, division, and awakening that our world and America is now facing. So, what did Edgar Cayce really say about the years leading up to 2026? What role does Donald Trump play in this unfolding story? And could Cayce's predictions actually reveal the turning point that changes not only America's destiny but humanity's future? The Great Change Time. Edgar Cayce called it the Great Change Time. It wasn't just another prophecy, it was his vision of a defining era for America, a time when the nation would be forced to look in the mirror and face its deepest divisions. The records of his readings, still preserved today at the Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach, continue to draw the attention of scientists and researchers from all over the world. Buried among those thousands of transcripts are predictions that seem to describe the very struggles we're witnessing right now. Cayce spoke of a period when America would undergo its greatest test, not just politically, but spiritually. He said a leader would emerge during a time of immense turmoil, someone who would divide the nation like never before. There would be economic instability, natural disasters, and a crisis that would test the soul of the country itself. He called this moment the Great Change. To Cayce, it wasn't the end of the world, it was a reckoning, a breaking down of old systems so that something new could be born. Cayce didn't just predict chaos in general terms, he outlined a sequence of events that he said would unfold in the mid-2020s. When you compare those readings to what's happening now politically, economically, and socially, the resemblance is hard to ignore. He spoke of a return, a re-emergence of a controversial figure who would spark both hope and fear. And he tied this return directly to the year 2026, calling it a great reckoning for America. Now, to be clear, Cayce never mentioned Donald Trump by name. He couldn't have. Trump was born a year after Cayce's death, but Cayce often described patterns and archetypes instead of individuals. He talked about a builder, a man associated with towers and gold, someone who would rise to power, promising to restore greatness, but would ultimately face an unprecedented trial. In one of Cayce's most discussed readings, number 3976-26, given in 1944, he was asked about America's future. His response was chilling. He spoke of upheavals in the political system, of people questioning their most basic beliefs, of a shifting of the poles. Many early researchers took that to mean a physical pole shift, the Earth itself changing. But modern scholars of Cayce's work believe he was speaking symbolically. The poles were political. They represented the extreme polarization we now see tearing at the heart of American society. In that same reading, Cayce described a time around 2026 when a leader who had once been celebrated and later rejected would face his ultimate test. He spoke of towers falling, not necessarily physical structures, but symbols of power and influence collapsing. He said this leader would be given a second chance, a return, but that the second rise would bring not peace, but chaos, the very storm he had once promised to stop. So, Trump's entire image has revolved around towers, Trump Tower, the gleaming skyscrapers bearing his name, the golden decor that defined his empire. Cayce's references to towers and gold in the context of America's future leadership feel almost prophetic. But Casey didn't stop at metaphor. He also tied these events to astrological cycles, something he frequently referenced in his readings. He said that certain planetary alignments would mark critical turning points for nations and leaders. Modern researchers studying Casey's astrological notes found that several of those key alignments converge in late 2026. According to Casey, this alignment signifies a moment of reckoning, a time when overreaching leaders fall and the balance of power shifts irreversibly. So what did Casey say would actually happen during this period? He predicted that when this controversial leader returned to power, his second time in office would bring 3 major crises, each one striking faster than the last. And together, they would test not only that leader's strength, but the very resilience of America itself. The 3 crises. When Casey spoke of the coming period, he didn't offer a single catastrophe, but a sequence of shocks that would arrive in quick succession and amplify one another. He described 3 major crises: economic, environmental, and constitutional, and the way they would interact is what makes the picture so dangerous. Taken together, these crises would not simply test policies or leaders, they would test the resilience of American institutions, the resolve of communities, and the moral choices of ordinary citizens. To understand why Casey's words still ring so loudly today, it helps to look at each crisis in turn and how, in his framework, each one triggers and magnifies the next. First is the economic collapse, Casey called a crumbling of false foundations. He pictured systems built on debt, speculation, and fragile international arrangements suddenly unraveling, and he emphasized the abruptness of the shock, a collapse that catches people asleep at the wheel. What makes that image feel relevant now is the way economic policy and geopolitics are intertwined. Trade disputes, tariffs, and the weakening of alliances can ripple through supply chains and credit systems faster than most people realize. In Casey's narrative, the leader's own aggressive economic posture measures meant to protect or boost the nation becomes the catalyst that exposes those fragile underpinnings. For a time, early wins or apparent strength mask deeper fragility. Then, when the external pressures align, the whole structure begins to collapse. The result is a global market shock that doesn't stay confined to Wall Street but flows into Main Street, into jobs, pensions, and international trust, and leaves governments scrambling for options they don't actually have. The second crisis is environmental, and here Casey's long history of earth change prophecies comes into play. He specifically warned about water-related catastrophes on America's East Coast floods, storm surges, and weather events that exceed preparation plans, while also referencing severe events elsewhere, like major disruptions on the West Coast. The key connection he makes is between leadership choices and environmental consequences. When leaders dismiss warnings, roll back protections, or prioritize short-term gains over resilience, ecosystems respond in ways that accelerate disasters. In Casey's timeline, environmental extremes arrive while the economy is already reeling, and the two together create cascading failures, ports closed by floods, energy infrastructure damaged by storms, supply lines broken just as markets are trying to stabilize. That combination turns a financial shock into a humanitarian crisis, overwhelming local and federal capacities and forcing communities to face losses they once thought unimaginable. The third and most politically explosive crisis Casey described is constitutional, an era when the rules and norms that hold democracy together are pushed to their limit. He used phrases like civil strife and the judgment of the builders to explain a moment when legal and moral reckonings converge. In this reading, leaders and institutions collide. A leader under intense legal and political pressure refuses to accept standard limits. Institutions respond defensively, and the public is torn between competing narratives of necessity and tyranny. Casey's image of the judgment of the builders imagines people who built power on shaky ethical or legal foundations facing exposure and accountability, and that exposure acts as a trigger for mass political unrest. What makes this scenario uniquely destabilizing is timing When economic collapse and environmental disasters are already eroding legitimacy, a constitutional confrontation becomes the spark that threatens to ignite widespread unrest, military involvement in domestic affairs, or a severe breakdown in civil order. A crucial detail in Casey's account is that he did not treat these crises as isolated punishments, but as a crucible for transformation. He saw the disruptive leader, the builder figure, as both cause and mirror, a figure whose policies and persona accelerate weaknesses, but also force hidden problems into the open. That paradox is central to understanding Casey's seriousness. The leader's second return, according to the readings, brings a mixture of charisma, policy action, and miscalculation that intensifies existing fractures. The legal troubles and public scandals that have followed this leader in real life are, in Casey's telling, part of what he called the judgment phase, a public unmasking of how fortunes and power were accumulated, and a moment when accountability and political survival collide. Casey doesn't leave us in hopelessness. He repeatedly framed these dark possibilities as potential turning points rather than inevitable doom. By exposing the weaknesses economic structures propped up by risky practices, environmental neglect, and institutions that tolerated ethical corners, the crises create a painful but necessary space for rebuilding. In his view, the shock is what forces a society to reevaluate priorities, to choose whether it will double down on authoritarian shortcuts or invest in long-term resilience, rule of law, and social cohesion. That choice, he implied, is in our hands. How communities respond, how ordinary people insist on accountability without sacrificing basic freedoms, and whether leaders step back from power plays to serve rather than dominate, will determine if the collapse becomes a gateway to renewal or a spiral into deeper disorder. Taken together, the three crises Casey described form a single narrative arc. A fragile economic order breaks, environmental realities compound human suffering and logistical strain, and political institutions are forced into a life-or-death test that will determine the nation's future character. The frightening clarity of Casey's scenario is that the crises feed one another, so the moment of reckoning is not distant or abstract, but compressed into a narrow window. Whether his specifics play out exactly as phrased, the larger lesson he kept repeating is practical and urgent: resilience, accountability, and a willingness to do the difficult work of rebuilding trust and systems can change the outcome. If the warnings are heeded, the crisis can be a passage. If they are ignored, the fractures deepen. America predictions came true. Because Casey's track record includes striking hits, predicting both world wars, describing the 1929 crash with eerie detail, foreseeing the Dead Sea Scrolls decades before discovery, and hinting at medical approaches that only later proved useful, researchers treat his mid-century readings with a seriousness that surprises many. Those aren't random boasts. They're documented statements transcribed by stenographers and preserved for decades, which is why when Casey began naming a turning point in the 2020 seconds, people paid attention. The detail that keeps coming up across separate readings is the number 26, and when you put those passages together, they sketch a much clearer picture than the usual fuzzy prophecy. A choice point for American democracy, one path toward higher consciousness and reform, the other toward authoritarian repetition of old mistakes. In reading 602-3 from 1938, Casey framed the decade's middle as the moment when the nation would have to decide whether to evolve or to fall back into patterns of centralized control and diminished civic life. He didn't spoon-feed names or party labels. Instead, he described dynamics promises that look real at first, short windows of prosperity that conceal deeper instability, and a leader whose early successes create a sense of vindication among supporters before the costs become apparent. That warning about a false dawn is crucial. The first year after a return might feel like proof that things are working, but according to Casey, those early gains mask structural weaknesses that later reveal themselves with a brutal clarity. By 2026, Casey's readings suggest three strands pull tight at once. The first is economic, policies that initially raise headline numbers but erode fundamentals through tariffs, fractured alliances, or short-term stimulus without sustainable backing suddenly expose an over-leveraged system. In practical terms, that means credit, stress, disrupted trade, and a loss of investor confidence that isn't limited to stock tickers. It spreads into jobs, pensions, and the everyday security people rely on. When trade partners retaliate or alliances weaken, the knock-on effects arrive faster than planning cycles can handle, turning a policy gamble into a global shock. At the same time, the second strand, environmental extremes, lands on a country already bruised by economic strain. Casey singled out flood and water-related catastrophes on the East Coast while also implying large disruptions elsewhere, and the compounding effect is what makes his scenario so dangerous. Imagine critical ports and coastal infrastructure out of service just as supply chains are trying to reroute, or emergency budgets diverted from recovery to stabilizing basic services. The combination of financial stress and failing infrastructure multiplies human suffering and stretches the capacity of local and federal response teams, creating scenes that look less like isolated disasters and more like systemic failure. The third and most volatile element is constitutional pressure. Casey's phrase, "the judgment of the builders," captures the idea that public, legal, and moral reckonings converge not simply as courtroom dramas, but as catalysts for mass political reaction. When leaders face unprecedented legal crises, while institutions struggle to enforce norms, the temptation to bypass limits in the name of stability grows. Casey warned of civil strife for exactly this reason. When people lose faith that public institutions are fair or effective, factionalism hardens, and ordinary disagreements can escalate into confrontations with armed actors, emergency measures, and a real risk that the military or security forces will be asked to choose sides. Put bluntly, Casey's synthesis is not a scripted conspiracy, but a chain reaction. Policy missteps shake the economy, environmental shocks break logistics and safety nets, and political polarization turns legal battles into existential disputes about the nature of government. The striking claim is that the leader who catalyzes this sequence is simultaneously the symbol of both the problem and the opportunity. A builder whose rise exposes the rot and forces a public reckoning over values, priorities, and the rules that hold society together. That doesn't mean Casey saw no hope. His readings consistently frame the crisis as a crucible, painful, destabilizing, and dangerous, but also a rare chance for deep transformation. If the nation responds by reaffirming democratic norms, rebuilding resilient systems, and investing in long-term environmental and economic health, then the very shocks that could have destroyed trust might instead clear space for reconstruction on more solid foundations. Conversely, if the reaction is fear-driven surrender to authoritarian shortcuts, the damage could be long-lasting. A hardest crisis happened than ever. When you put Casey's warnings together, the picture becomes uncomfortably sharp. He didn't merely sketch theoretical risks, he described a moment when America could very nearly break inward, a time when the strain of economic collapse, environmental disaster, and political polarization would push ordinary institutions to make extraordinary choices. In reading 3,976-18, he lays out a scenario in which armed factions come face to face in our own cities, and where the military, reluctantly pulled into the chaos, is forced to decide which side to support. He is careful to call this a possibility, not an inevitability, but the force of his language makes clear how close the nation could come to a hard crisis if certain choices are made and certain pressures converge. The trigger, Casey says, is not a slow erosion, but a contested action, a bold, divisive measure taken by the leader that half the country views as necessary and the other half sees as tyrannical. It is that rupture which, in his timeline, happens in 2026 and sparks a rapid escalation. protests that swell into violent clashes, emergency measures that strain civil liberties, and deployments of troops into major urban centers, not to repel an external foe, but to restore order amid internal breakdown. Imagine the psychological shock of soldiers patrolling streets where neighbors once met at coffee shops. This is the fork-in-the-road moment Casey warns about, when the country must choose whether to pull back or to plunge further into chaos. Yet Casey's prophecy does not end in despair. Intertwined with the darker passages are specific glimpses of a path through a kind of spiritual and social recovery that begins only after things have been driven to the brink. He speaks of people remembering what matters, of communities rediscovering bonds that political rhetoric had frayed, and of grassroots efforts that bridge divides because survival forces cooperation. In his view, the crisis itself functions like a furnace, raw, dangerous, and purifying, and from it can come an awakening of conscience and solidarity if enough people refuse to be swallowed by fear. Timing matters a great deal in Casey's account. He flags the late summer to autumn window of 2026 as particularly critical, and he singles out November, the month of the midterm elections, as a defining moment. He envisions elections that are not ordinary contests over policy, but a referendum on the nature of governance itself, a moment when procedural choices will be read as existential ones. The results, he suggests, would surprise everyone. Neither party would capture the narrative they expected, and the apparent winner-loser calculus would be complicated by new alignments and shocks that reshuffle the political map. One of the more striking and hopeful threads in Casey's readings is the appearance of what he calls the unexpected ally. This is not a conventional politician, but a healer-type figure who steps forward from outside the usual arenas of power. Their strength, Casey implies, lies in practical problem-solving and in the ability to appeal to common human needs rather than to partisan ideology, drawing together people who had become estranged. Whether this figure is already known to the public or has yet to emerge, Casey paints them as someone whose presence helps stabilize fractured communities and provide an alternative narrative to polarization. All of this matters because we're not reading an ancient prophecy in a vacuum. We are living in 2025, and the pieces Casey pointed to a returning controversial leader, deeper divisions, a fraying international order, and mounting economic and environmental warning signs feel alarmingly present. That proximity is why his writings still stir debate. The readings function both as a warning and as a call to action. They ask us to notice the pressure points, to strengthen civic institutions, to refuse simplistic answers that trade liberty for the illusion of security, and to look for those practical leaders who can heal rather than inflame. The Awakeness Year. The year 2026, according to Casey, marks a pivotal moment in human history. It's described as an epoch where a collective awakening occurs the world. He believed that by 2026, humanity would experience a significant spiritual awakening, leading to a deeper connection with our inner selves and a greater awareness of our interconnectedness with all living beings. This prediction resonates with the increasing interest in mindfulness, meditation, and holistic well-being practices in our modern society. As scientific and technological advancements have dominated our collective focus, many have found themselves feeling increasingly disconnected from a sense of meaning and purpose in their lives. That is what Edgar Cayce saw long ago, and he believed that 2024 is the perfect time for everyone to awaken. We all need to seek out ways to reconnect with their inner selves and find greater fulfillment in life. Edgar Cayce also spoke about the awakening that people must experience after leaving this world. He told, "After death, we may enter a region that is void of love, life, and light, void of everything. For some, this region is approximately their wish come true. Here, they are truly alone with themselves. For some souls, this is a pain that is unbearable. In the absence of truth, love, gentleness, and kindness, some souls fill the void with an irrational and unbelievable amount of pain and fear. It is so dark in the realm of outer darkness that the darkness hurts, and panic grips them without knowing why. There are various degrees of darkness to this realm, and it is darker and denser at the center than at its outer fringes. The closer we are to the outer edges, the more interaction there is with others in the realm. The closer to the center, the darker and more painful is the solitude. Those who find themselves in outer darkness cannot travel across this dimension. They must grow through the levels of this realm. After death, one may find themselves in a particular degree of darkness that most closely corresponds to the degree of the absence of love in one's life. Outer darkness is not a punishment. It is a region which operates lawfully for the benefit of those who are there. This region is not a realm which was created for any soul to experience, but one which came about as a consequence of the negative activity of souls in creation. So great has been the desire for self, so monumental across time and space has been the selfishness of some of God's creatures, that this realm is the creation or manifestation of their own collective activities. Outer darkness and the reality with which it is associated were created and are held in place by collective self-interest. Being spiritually awakened means that an individual has had a profound shift in their understanding of themselves and the world around them. This awakening often comes after a period of feeling disconnected, lost, or unfulfilled in life. Interestingly, some individuals report experiencing physical symptoms, such as a fever, during their spiritual awakening, signifying a kind of intense inner burning away of old beliefs and patterns. Spiritual awakening can happen suddenly or gradually, and it often involves a change in perception, a deepening of self-awareness, and a newfound sense of connection to a higher power, even amidst internal conflict. Spiritual awakening can take many forms and can be experienced in different ways by different people. Some common signs and symptoms of spiritual awakening can include a greater sense of empathy, compassion, and love towards others, an increased ability to live in the present moment, a deeper connection to nature and the universe, a heightened awareness of synchronicities and signs, and a sense of inner peace and contentment. Ultimately, being spiritually awakened means that an individual has come to a new level of understanding and awareness about themselves and the natural world. It's through this ascension process that you realize your potential and find the ability to change your life profoundly. In other words, they've had a spiritual ascension. Now, it's important to understand the difference between awakening and ascension. At the same time, spiritual awakening refers to the internal shift in consciousness that an individual experiences, leading to a profound change in their understanding of themselves and the world. Ascension, specifically 5D ascension, signifies an evolution beyond the physical reality into a realm of higher spiritual enlightenment and awareness. This spiritual ascension, often referred to as 5D ascension, signifies a shift from the three-dimensional physical reality to a five-dimensional realm of spiritual enlightenment and awareness. It often involves a newfound sense of purpose and direction in life, as well as a deepening of one's spiritual practices and beliefs. And if you have these signs, might be you are experiencing a spiritual awakening. One of the first signs of spiritual awakening is heightened intuition. Intuition is often described as an inner knowing, a subtle voice or feeling that guides us without conscious reasoning. Imagine moments when you suddenly just know the right path to take, or when you understand something without needing to analyze it. These instances become more frequent and pronounced. You might make decisions based on a feeling or a hunch, which often are remarkably accurate and beneficial. This heightened intuition keeps you in tune with your inner voice, which speaks from your true self, free from overthinking and external influences. The noise of everyday life dims, allowing you to hear the wisdom inside you all along. As you experience this shift, your intuition becomes a source of creativity and inspiration. You may discover new solutions to problems or feel inspired to take paths you hadn't considered before. Trusting this inner guidance can be empowering, leading to a deeper understanding of yourself and your purpose. Increased empathy and compassion is the second sign. You may gain a deeper empathy and compassion as you journey through a spiritual awakening. Suddenly, the boundaries between your emotions and those of others might seem blurred, allowing you to feel what they feel with a heightened sense of understanding and sensitivity. You might genuinely experience the ebbs and flows of emotions that others are going through. This increased empathy can extend to all living beings, people, animals, and the environment. You become more at one with the subtle expressions of nature and the silent voices of animals, sensing their unspoken stories and needs. Alongside empathy, your compassion also grows. This might manifest in small acts of kindness, like offering a listening ear to a friend or helping a stranger in need. Or it could inspire more significant changes in your life, such as volunteering for causes you care about or making lifestyle choices that are more considerate of the planet and its population. This increase in empathy and compassion is a sign of your heart opening and your consciousness expanding. You start to see the interconnectedness of all life, recognizing that the well-being of others directly impacts your own. As enriching as this heightened empathy and compassion can be, looking after yourself is important. Being deeply attuned to the emotions of others can feel overwhelming at times. Setting healthy emotional boundaries helps you maintain your emotional well-being. The next sign that you need to focus on is desire for meaningful connections. A key aspect of experiencing a spiritual awakening is the desire for deeper, more meaningful connections in your life. This shift often begins as a growing dissatisfaction with superficial interactions and a hunger for relationships that offer genuine depth and authenticity. You may find yourself longing for conversations beyond the mundane, seeking to connect on a level that nourishes your soul and aligns with your newfound understanding of the world. As you embark on this journey, the nature of your relationships may begin to change. You might gravitate towards people who share your values and perspectives or challenge you to grow and think in new ways. You might seek out those who understand and respect your journey in your friendships, offering support and wisdom. In romantic relationships, you may desire a partner who supports and participates in your spiritual growth. Even in professional settings, you might find yourself drawn to work that feels more aligned with your values and allows for authentic expression. This shift can also mean letting go of relationships that no longer serve your growth. Recognizing that some connections might hinder your journey is an essential part of this process. It's about finding balance and ensuring that your social circle reflects and supports your spiritual path. Changing priorities is also a special sign. During a spiritual awakening, one of the most noticeable changes is your priorities and values. You might find yourself reassessing what truly matters to you, leading to a significant shift in how you view and interact with the world. You'll begin to value personal growth, meaningful relationships, and enriching experiences over material possessions. This realization can be liberating, freeing you from pursuing material gains and allowing you to focus on what genuinely enriches your life. As personal growth climbs higher on your list of priorities, you might invest more time and energy in activities that nurture your mind, body, and spirit. This could include meditation, yoga, reading, or creative hobbies. The joy in these activities often comes from the inner peace and self-discovery they bring. Relationships also take on a new significance. You value deeper connections with others that are based on mutual respect, understanding, and support. These relationships provide a sense of belonging and offer a space for mutual growth and sharing life experiences. Experiences themselves become more valuable than possessions. Travel, learning new skills, or spending quality time with loved ones might become more important. These experiences enrich your life in ways that material items cannot, providing lasting memories and a sense of fulfillment deeply rooted in living a meaningful life. Let's continue with feeling a sense of unity. A symptom often experienced during a spiritual awakening is a deep-seated feeling of unity or oneness. It connects to a larger, universal energy, being in harmony with all forms of life. You might experience moments where you feel deeply in tune with nature, sensing a sacred kinship with the trees, the sky, the ocean, and every living creature. In your interactions with people, you may recognize that everyone, regardless of their background or life story, shares the same fundamental desires for love, security, and happiness. This realization can foster empathy and compassion as you begin to see reflections of yourself in others. Judgments and barriers fade, replaced by an understanding of the universal human experience. You might also become more aware of how your actions impact the world. This awareness can lead to more mindful, conscious living, where your choices are guided by a desire to contribute positively to the collective well-being. Last but not least, it's experiencing moments of bliss. A spiritual awakening often brings with it unexpected moments of bliss and joy. These experiences can feel like bursts of pure happiness from deep within and often occur without any apparent external cause. These moments of bliss can catch you by surprise. You might be engaged in a mundane task or sitting quietly when suddenly overwhelmed by immense peace and happiness. This isn't the kind of joy that comes from external rewards or achievements. It feels more intrinsic, as if you're tapping into a deep well of contentment within you. This bliss is often accompanied by feeling connected to something greater than yourself. It's as if, in that moment, you're experiencing a deep truth about life and your place in the universe. These experiences can be deeply moving and transformative, offering a glimpse into being free from worry, stress, or negativity. These experiences can be incredibly rejuvenating. In the aftermath of such bliss, you might feel more energized, optimistic, and at peace with yourself and the world around you. It's a reminder of the potential for joy that resides within us all, waiting to be uncovered.